Have you ever lived with someone for decades and suddenly realized you don't really know them at all? That's what happened to me after 40 years of marriage. My name is Robert, and I thought I knew everything about my wife, Margaret. I was wrong. Dead wrong. The basement steps creaked at exactly 11:47 p.m. every single night. I knew because I'd been listening to that sound for 40 years, lying in our bed upstairs, wondering what Margaret was doing down there in the darkness. She always said she was just checking the water heater or organizing storage boxes, but it never made sense to me. Who organizes boxes in the middle of the night? For 4 decades, I respected her privacy. Margaret was entitled to her routines, her quirks, her late-night habits. We all have them. But on the night of our 40th wedding anniversary, something changed. Maybe it was the wine from dinner, or maybe it was the realization that we were both getting older, and time was running out for secrets. Whatever it was, I finally decided I needed to know what my wife was really doing in that basement every night. The house we'd lived in since 1983 was a modest 2-story colonial with a finished basement that Margaret had always claimed as her domain. When we first moved in, she'd insisted on handling all the basement organization herself. "It's my project," she'd say with that gentle smile that had captured my heart 42 years ago. "Let me have this one thing that's just mine." Back then I thought it was sweet. Margaret was a kindergarten teacher who spent her days surrounded by children, managing chaos, following schedules set by others. If she wanted to control how we stored our Christmas decorations and old photo albums, what was the harm in that? But as the years passed, her basement visits became more frequent, more secretive. She'd wait until she thought I was asleep, then slip out of bed and pad downstairs in her slippers. Sometimes she'd be gone for 20 minutes, sometimes for 2 hours. When she'd return, she'd smell faintly of something I couldn't identify. Not quite cleaning supplies, not quite dust. Something else. "What were you doing down there, honey?" I'd ask in the morning over coffee. "Oh, just tidying up," she'd say, never quite meeting my eyes. "You know how it is. One thing leads to another, but I didn't know how it was. I'd tried to go down to the basement myself plenty of times over the years, but Margaret always seemed to intercept me. "I'll get that for you," she'd say if I mentioned needing something from storage. "No need for you to go down there." Or she'd suddenly remember an urgent task that required my immediate attention upstairs. The few times I did make it to the basement, it looked perfectly normal. Clean, organized, nothing out of place. Plastic storage bins labeled in Margaret's neat handwriting, Christmas ornaments, winter clothes, Robert's books, a workbench along one wall, a washer and dryer, a water heater humming quietly in the corner. Nothing unusual, but there was always that locked door. It was painted the same white as the rest of the basement walls, tucked into an alcove behind the furnace. The door had an old-fashioned deadbolt lock, the kind you need a key to open from either side. When I'd asked Margaret about it when we first moved in, she'd said it was probably a storage closet that the previous owners had locked and forgotten about. "Should we call a locksmith?" I'd suggested. "It's probably just junk," she'd said with a shrug. "Not worth the expense. That was 40 years ago, and the door had remained locked ever since." But here's the thing that started bothering me. Margaret always carried a small ring of keys in her robe pocket during her nighttime basement visits. I'd seen the outline of them, heard the soft jingle when she walked. She said they were just spare house keys, but why would someone need spare keys to organize storage boxes? Our 40th anniversary dinner had been perfect. We'd gone to Giuseppe's, the same Italian restaurant where we'd had our first date in 1981. Margaret had worn the blue dress I'd bought her for Christmas, and she'd looked as beautiful as ever, even at 62. We'd talked about our children. James was doing well as an engineer in Portland, and Lisa had just been promoted to manager at her marketing firm in Chicago. We'd talked about retirement, about maybe selling the house and moving somewhere warmer. 40 years, Margaret had said, raising her wine glass. Where did the time go? "Best 40 years of my life," I'd replied, and I'd meant it. But as we'd driven home through the quiet suburban streets, I'd found myself thinking about that basement door again. 40 years of secrets. 40 years of wondering. Maybe it was time to finally get some answers. Margaret fell asleep quickly that night, her breathing deep and even beside me. At 11:30, I was still wide awake, staring at the ceiling and listening for the familiar creak of floorboards that would signal her nightly journey downstairs. And 47. p.m., right on schedule. I heard her slip out of bed, heard the soft whisper of her slippers on the hardwood floor, heard the gentle click of the bedroom door closing behind her. For the first time in 40 years, instead of rolling over and going back to sleep, I got up and followed her. The hallway was dark, lit only by the faint glow of streetlights through the window at the far end. I moved carefully, avoiding the spots where I knew the floorboards creaked. Margaret was already at the bottom of the stairs, and I could see the glow of a flashlight bobbing through the basement. I crept down the stairs, pausing at the bottom to listen. The basement was silent, except for the hum of the water heater and the soft sound of Margaret moving around. I peered around the corner and saw the beam of her flashlight disappearing behind the furnace, toward that locked door I'd wondered about for so many years. My heart was pounding as I crept closer, staying in the shadows behind the staircase. I heard the soft jingle of keys, then the metallic click of a lock turning. A door creaked open. Light spilled out from behind the furnace, not harsh fluorescent light, but a warm, soft glow like candlelight. I heard Margaret's footsteps moving inside whatever room was behind that door, heard the soft scrape of something being moved, the rustle of papers. I waited, barely breathing, for 20 minutes. Finally, I heard her coming back out. The light dimmed. The door closed with a soft click. The lock turned again. Margaret's footsteps moved back across the basement and up the stairs. I stayed hidden behind the staircase until I heard our bedroom door close upstairs. Then I made my way back up as quietly as I could. Margaret was already back in bed, breathing deeply as if she'd been asleep for hours. But I couldn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions. What was behind that door? What was Margaret doing in there every night? Why had she kept it secret for 40 years? The next morning at breakfast, I studied my wife's face as she poured my coffee and buttered my toast. She looked the same as always. Grey hair pulled back in a neat bun, reading glasses perched on her nose as she scanned the morning newspaper. The same gentle expression she'd worn every morning for 4 decades. "Sleep well?" she asked without looking up from the paper. "Like a baby," I lied. "You? Oh, you know me. I'm a restless sleeper. I think I got up a few times during the night." It was the same conversation we'd had thousands of times before, but now I was listening with different ears. Every word seemed loaded with hidden meaning. After Margaret left for work, she still taught part-time at the elementary school, 3 days a week. I found myself standing at the top of the basement stairs. I'd been down there countless times over the years, but now it felt different. Now I knew there was a secret room behind that locked door, a secret room where my wife spent time every night. I walked down the stairs slowly, my hand trailing along the wooden railing we'd installed 20 years ago when Margaret complained that the original metal one was too cold in winter. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Concrete floor painted grey, wooden paneling on the walls, fluorescent lights humming overhead. But I walked directly to the alcove behind the furnace, to that white door I'd wondered about for so many years. Up close I could see scuff marks on the floor in front of it, evidence of frequent use. The doorknob showed signs of wear, despite Margaret's claim that the room had been locked and forgotten by the previous owners. I tried the handle, knowing it would be locked. So it was. I examined the deadbolt. It was sturdy, professional grade, not the kind of cheap lock you'd use to secure a storage closet full of junk. This was the kind of lock you'd use to keep people out of something important, or to keep something in. That thought sent a chill down my spine. What if Margaret wasn't just visiting this room every night? What if there was something or someone in there that needed to be contained? I shook my head, trying to dispel such dark thoughts. This was Margaret we were talking about. Sweet, gentle Margaret, who couldn't bring herself to kill the spiders in our bathtub, who cried when she had to give a student a failing grade. Whatever was behind that door, it couldn't be anything sinister. Could it? I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on normal activities. I mowed the lawn, cleaned the gutters, watched a baseball game on TV, but my mind kept drifting back to that basement door. What was Margaret hiding from me? And why, after 40 years of marriage, was she still keeping secrets? That evening, Margaret seemed different. More nervous, more watchful. She kept glancing at me during dinner, as if she was trying to read something in my expression. "Is everything all right?" she asked as we sat on the couch watching the evening news. "You seem distracted." "Just tired," I said. "Long day." But Margaret's intuition had always been sharp. She knew me too well, could read my moods like a book she'd memorized. I could see the concern in her eyes, the way she kept studying my face when she thought I wasn't looking. At 11:30 that night, I lay in bed pretending to be asleep, listening for the sound of Margaret getting up. But the minutes ticked by and she didn't move. 11:47 came and went. Midnight, 12:30. Margaret lay beside me, breathing quietly but not with the deep rhythm of sleep. She was waiting for me to fall asleep first. The realization hit me like a cold wave. Margaret knew I was suspicious. Somehow she'd sensed that something had changed, that I was paying attention in a way I never had before. She was being more careful, which meant that whatever was behind that basement door was important enough to risk staying awake all night to protect. The next morning, Margaret called in sick to work. She said she had a headache, but I noticed she kept finding excuses to stay close to the house. When I suggested running errands, she said she'd rather rest. When I mentioned meeting my brother for lunch, she asked if I could postpone it. It was like she was guarding the house, guarding whatever secret she'd been keeping in that basement room. That afternoon, while Margaret was napping on the couch, I snuck down to the basement again. This time I examined the door more carefully, looking for any way to see inside. The door fit snugly in its frame, no gaps wide enough to peer through. But as I knelt down to examine the lock more closely, I noticed something I'd missed before. There was a small hole in the wall next to the door, barely visible unless you were looking at floor level. It was perfectly round, about the size of a quarter, and it looked intentional rather than accidental. When I put my ear to the hole, I could hear something from inside the room, soft music. Classical music playing very quietly, and something else, a sound that made my blood run cold, breathing. Someone else's breathing. I jerked back from the hole, my heart hammering in my chest. There was someone in that room. Someone breathing, someone listening to music, someone who Margaret visited every single night for 40 years. Who was it? How long had they been there? And why had Margaret never told me? I crept back upstairs on shaking legs, my mind reeling with possibilities. Was Margaret hiding a relative? An old boyfriend? Someone who was supposed to be dead? The scenarios that ran through my head ranged from strange to terrifying. That night I couldn't even pretend to sleep. I lay rigid in bed, staring at the ceiling while Margaret breathed quietly beside me. At 11:30 she stirred, but when she felt me shift slightly, she went still again. We were both awake, both pretending to sleep, both waiting for the other to give in first. It was like a 40-year marriage had suddenly become a chess game, and I didn't even know what pieces were on the board. Finally, around 2 a.m., exhaustion won out and I drifted off. I was awakened an hour later by the sound of footsteps on the basement stairs. Margaret had waited until she was sure I was deeply asleep, then made her nightly journey. I lay there listening, imagining her unlocking that door, stepping into that secret room, talking quietly to whoever was inside. Who was it? What did they talk about? How had Margaret managed to keep this secret for so long? When she returned to bed 40 minutes later, I pretended to be asleep, but I could smell that strange scent on her again. Not cleaning supplies, not dust, something else. Something that reminded me of old books and dried flowers. The next day was Saturday. Margaret suggested we spend the day together, maybe drive to the lake, have a picnic. It was a beautiful day, she said. We should get out of the house, but I wasn't ready to leave. Not when I was so close to finally understanding what my wife had been hiding from me for 4 decades. You go ahead, I said. I have some projects to finish up around here. Margaret's face fell. What kind of projects? Oh, just some repairs. Nothing major. What needs repairing? I could see the worry in her eyes, the way her hands twisted together in her lap. She was afraid I was planning to go to the basement. The basement stairs are getting a little wobbly, I said, watching her reaction carefully. I thought I'd tighten them up. Margaret went pale. The stairs are fine, Robert. I use them all the time. They're perfectly safe. Still, I should check them out. Safety first, right? I really think we should go to the lake, Margaret said, her voice taking on a desperate edge. It's such a beautiful day. We can work on the house tomorrow. But I'd made up my mind. After 40 years of questions, I was finally going to get some answers. You go ahead, I said again. I'll stay here and take care of this. Margaret stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to decide what to do. Finally, she stood up, her movements sharp and jerky. I'll stay too, she said. We can work on the house together, which meant I wasn't going to get anywhere near that basement as long as Margaret was in the house, unless I found another way. That Saturday afternoon stretched on like the longest day of my life. Margaret shadowed my every move, finding excuses to stay close whenever I headed toward the basement stairs. When I went to the garage to get some tools, she suddenly decided to organize the hall closet right next to the basement door. When I mentioned checking the circuit breaker, she insisted we call an electrician instead. It was like living with a prison guard, except the guard was my wife of 40 years. By evening, we were both exhausted from this strange dance we'd been doing all day. Margaret had dark circles under her eyes, and I could see the strain in the way she held her shoulders. The forced cheerfulness in her voice when she suggested we order pizza for dinner. "We don't have to cook tonight," she said. But I could hear the underlying message. We don't have to go to the basement where the freezer is. As we sat eating pizza in front of the television, I studied Margaret's profile in the flickering light. This woman I'd shared my life with, who knew how I liked my coffee and which side of the bed I preferred, who could finish my sentences and read my moods. She'd been living with a secret so big that she was willing to guard it with sleepless nights and constant vigilance. What could be worth all this? That night I lay awake until nearly 3 a.m., listening to Margaret's breathing. She was awake too. I could tell by the way she held herself too still, too quiet. Neither of us was fooling the other anymore. Finally, exhaustion won out and I dozed off. I was awakened at dawn by the sound of the shower running. Margaret was up early, getting ready for church. She always went to the 8 a.m. service at St. Mary's, had done so every Sunday for as long as I'd known her. I usually went with her, but this Sunday I had other plans. "Not feeling well," I told her when she asked if I was coming. "I think I'll stay home and rest." Margaret paused in the doorway, her purse clutched in her hands, her church dress neat and pressed. "Are you sure? Maybe some fresh air would help, I'm sure." "You go ahead." She hesitated, and I could see her wrestling with herself. She wanted to stay and guard her secret, but she also didn't want to break her 40-year streak of perfect church attendance. Finally, duty won out. "I'll be back by 10, she said. "Try to get some rest." The moment her car pulled out of the driveway, I was headed for the basement. I'd had all night to think about this, to plan my approach. The door was locked, but every lock had a weakness. I'd learned that much from 40 years of home ownership and occasional lockouts. I started by examining the hinges. They were on the inside of the door, so I couldn't remove the pins. Next, I checked the frame around the lock. The door was solid wood, but the frame was older, softer pine. With the right tools, I might be able to work the strike plate loose. I went to my workbench and gathered what I needed: a thin chisel, a small pry bar, and a flashlight. My hands were shaking as I positioned the chisel against the wood around the strike plate. I felt like a criminal breaking into my own house, but I had to know what Margaret was hiding. The wood was old and dry, and it gave way more easily than I'd expected. 20 minutes of careful work, and I had the strike plate loose enough that the deadbolt could slide past it. My heart was pounding as I turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The first thing that hit me was the smell, that strange scent I'd noticed on Margaret all these years. It was stronger here, concentrated. Old books, dried flowers, and something else I couldn't identify. Something medicinal. The room was larger than I'd expected, about 12 feet square with no windows. The walls were lined with bookshelves, but these weren't ordinary books. They were photo albums, journals, scrapbooks, boxes of letters and documents. The soft light I'd seen came from several battery-powered lanterns positioned around the room. But what drew my attention immediately was the hospital. Bed in the center of the room. It was an old-style bed with metal railings, the kind you'd see in a nursing home or long-term care facility. The sheets were clean and white, and there were several pillows propped up against the headboard. On the bedside table were bottles of medication, glasses of water, and what looked like a small bell. Someone lived in this room. Someone who needed medical care. With trembling hands, I picked up one of the medication bottles. The prescription label was faded but still readable. Eleanor Mitchell, take as needed for pain. The date on the bottle was from 6 months ago. Eleanor Mitchell. I'd never heard that name before in my life. I moved to the bookshelves, pulling down photo albums and opening them with shaking fingers. The first album contained pictures I'd never seen before. Margaret as a young woman, maybe 18 or 19, with her arm around another girl about the same age. The other girl had Margaret's eyes but darker hair, a rounder face. In photo after photo they were together, at graduation, at what looked like a wedding, holding babies, celebrating birthdays. The girl in the photos looked familiar, but I couldn't place where I might have seen her before. I opened a leather-bound journal and read the first entry. Written in Margaret's neat handwriting, "Eleanor is getting worse. The doctors say there's nothing more they can do. She asked me today if I remember the time we got lost in the woods behind Dad's house and had to spend the night under that old oak tree. She made me promise I'd never leave her alone. I promised Eleanor, the woman in the photos. The name on the medication bottles. I flipped through more journal entries, my hands shaking as I read, Eleanor can't walk anymore. I've moved her bed to the basement where it's quiet and she can rest. She doesn't want anyone to know how bad it's gotten. She's always been proud." Robert asked about the locked door again today. I told him it was just storage. I hate lying to him, but Eleanor made me promise. She doesn't want to be a burden on anyone. Eleanor had a good day today. We looked through old photos, and she told me stories about our childhood that I'd forgotten. She's the only family I have left. I sank into the chair next to the bed, the journal clutched in my hands, trying to process what I was reading. Margaret had a sister who was living in our basement, who had been living here for years, maybe decades. A sister she'd never mentioned to me, not once in 40 years of marriage, but why? Why keep Eleanor a secret? Why not tell me she had a sister who needed care? I continued reading through the journals, and slowly the story began to emerge. Eleanor had been born with developmental disabilities and had lived in state institutions for most of her adult life. When their parents died 20 years ago, Margaret had been faced with a choice. Let Eleanor remain in the overcrowded, underfunded facility where she'd been living, or bring her home. She'd chosen to bring Eleanor home, but Eleanor was ashamed of her condition, afraid of being seen as a burden, terrified of being sent back to an institution. She'd begged Margaret to keep her existence secret, to let the world believe she'd died along with their parents. "She's all I have left of my family," Margaret had written. "How can I abandon her now?" So for 20 years, Margaret had been caring for her sister in secret, getting up every night to check on her, to give her medication, to sit with her when she couldn't sleep. All those times I'd thought Margaret was organizing boxes or checking the water heater. She'd been taking care of Eleanor. The devoted teacher who spent her days caring for other people's children came home every night to care for her disabled sister, never asking for help, never complaining, never even acknowledging the enormous burden she'd taken on. I heard a car door slam in the driveway. Margaret was home from church. I quickly put the journal back where I'd found it and hurried out of the room, pulling the door closed behind me. My hands were shaking as I repositioned the strike plate, trying to make it look undisturbed. I could hear Margaret's footsteps on the front porch as I gathered my tools and headed back upstairs. "Robert," she called as she came through the front door. "How are you feeling?" "Better," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "Much better." Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing her church dress, her face anxious. "You look pale. Are you sure you're all right?" I looked at my wife, really looked at her. The grey hair I'd thought was from age, the tired lines around her eyes I'd attributed to her teaching job, the way she sometimes seemed distracted or preoccupied. It all made sense now. Margaret had been carrying an enormous secret, an enormous responsibility for 20 years. "I'm fine," I said. "Just tired, but I wasn't fine." I was reeling from what I'd discovered, from the realization that the woman I'd been married to for 40 years had an entire other life I'd known nothing about. That afternoon, I found myself watching Margaret with new eyes. The way she glanced toward the basement door every few minutes, the way she seemed to be listening for something only she could hear. Around 4 o'clock, she excused herself to go downstairs and check on the laundry. She was gone for 30 minutes. When she came back up, she had that familiar scent on her clothes, old books and dried flowers and something medicinal. The scent of caring for Eleanor. That night I didn't even pretend to sleep. When Margaret got up at 11:47, I lay still and listened to her footsteps on the basement stairs, imagining what was happening in that secret room. Was Eleanor awake? Did they talk? What was Margaret's nightly routine down there? When Margaret returned an hour later, I could hear her moving around in the bathroom, washing her hands, probably changing her clothes, taking care to remove any trace of where she'd been. The next morning I made a decision. "Margaret," I said over breakfast, "we need to talk." She looked up from her coffee, her eyes immediately wary. "About what?" "About Eleanor." The coffee cup slipped from Margaret's hands, shattering against the kitchen floor in a spray of ceramic and hot liquid. She stared at me with an expression of pure terror, her face white as paper. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered. "Yes, you do. I know about your sister. I know she's been living in our basement for 20 years. I know you've been taking care of her." Margaret's hands were shaking as she reached for paper towels to clean up the spilled coffee. How did you find out?" "I went into the room yesterday while you were at church. I saw the bed, the medications, the journals. Margaret, why didn't you tell me?" She sank into her chair, the paper towels forgotten in her hands. For a moment I thought she might faint. Then slowly she began to cry. "She made me promise," Margaret said through her tears. "Eleanor made me promise never to tell anyone she was still alive. She was so ashamed, so afraid of being a burden. She'd rather people think she was dead than know she needed help. But Margaret, I'm your husband. We could have taken care of her together." "You don't understand," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "Eleanor she's not like other people. She has the mind of a child in some ways, but she's also incredibly proud. When our parents died and I brought her home from the institution, she begged me not to tell anyone. She said she'd rather die than have people pity her or see her as broken." I moved around the table and knelt beside Margaret's chair, taking her hands in mine. "How long has she been sick?" "She has a degenerative neurological condition. It's been getting worse for the past 5 years. The doctors say—" Margaret's voice broke again. "They say she probably doesn't have much time left." All those nights, all those years, Margaret had been carrying this burden alone, taking care of a dying sister while maintaining the pretense of a normal life, never asking for help, never even acknowledging the enormous sacrifice she was making. "Can I meet her?" I asked gently. Margaret's eyes widened in panic. "Oh no, Robert, I can't. I promised her. She'd be so upset if she knew you found out. Margaret, she's my family too now. Let me help you take care of her. You don't understand what she's like when she gets upset. She becomes inconsolable, sometimes for days. The stress makes her condition worse." I could see the conflict in Margaret's eyes, the desire to finally share this burden with someone, warring with 20 years of ingrained secrecy and her sister's wishes. "What if we approach it slowly?" I suggested. "What if you told her that you'd like me to help, that you trust me, that I wouldn't judge her?" Margaret was quiet for a long time, staring down at our joined hands. Finally, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "She's all I have left of my real family, Robert. If I lose her because I broke my promise, you won't lose her. And Margaret, I've been your family for 40 years. We're in this together now." That afternoon, Margaret went down to the basement alone. She was gone for over an hour, and when she came back up, her eyes were red from crying. "She's very upset," Margaret said. "She keeps asking if you're going to make her go back to an institution." I told her no, but she doesn't believe me. "What did you tell her about me?" "I told her that you're a good man, that you've been taking care of me for 40 years, and that you want to take care of her too." But she's scared, Robert. She's been hidden away for so long, the idea of anyone else knowing about her terrifies her. That night, Margaret's routine changed for the first time in 40 years. Instead of going down to the basement at 11:47, she went at 11:30, and she asked me to come with her. "Just to the bottom of the stairs," she said. "Eleanor needs to know you're not a threat, that you're not going to hurt her or take her away." We walked down the basement stairs together, Margaret's hand tight in mine. At the bottom, she stopped and called out softly, "Eleanor, I have Robert with me. He's the one I told you about. He wants to say hello." From behind the locked door came a voice I'd never heard before, high and childlike, trembling with fear. "I don't want to see anyone. Please make him go away." "It's okay," I called out gently. "I'm not going to bother you. I just wanted you to know that I care about you because Margaret cares about you." Silence from behind the door. "Eleanor," Margaret said, "Robert brought you something. Can I show it to you?" I looked at Margaret in confusion. I hadn't brought anything. Margaret pulled a small wrapped package from her robe pocket and whispered to me, "Chocolate." She loves chocolate, but I can only give it to her rarely because of her medications. She knocked softly on the door. "Eleanor, I'm going to slide something under the door for you, okay?" The package disappeared under the door, and we heard the soft sound of paper being unwrapped. Then for the first time I heard Eleanor laugh, a sweet, innocent sound that reminded me of the children in Margaret's kindergarten class. "Thank you," Eleanor's voice came through the door. "It's been so long since I had chocolate." "Robert brought it for you," Margaret said. "He wanted to do something nice." Another long silence. "Then he can come say hello tomorrow, but just for a minute." As we walked back upstairs, I put my arm around Margaret's shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she leaned into me the way she used to. 40 years, I said quietly. 40 years you've been taking care of her by yourself." "She's my sister," Margaret said simply. What else could I do? But I was beginning to understand that there was more to this story. More secrets that Margaret hadn't shared yet. Because as I thought back to all those journals I'd seen, all those photos, I realized there were gaps in the timeline that didn't make sense. Eleanor had been in our basement for 20 years, but Margaret had been going down there every night for 40 years. What had she been doing for the first 20 years of our marriage? Tomorrow I was going to find out. The next evening, Margaret and I descended the basement stairs together for the second time in 40 years. This time Margaret carried a small tray with tea and cookies, Eleanor's favorites, she told me. My hands were sweating as we approached that white door. Knowing I was about to meet the sister Margaret had hidden from me for 2 decades. "Remember," Margaret whispered as she unlocked the door, "Eleanor gets overwhelmed easily. If she asks you to leave, please don't take it personally." The door swung open, and I got my first look at the secret room in full light. It was even more elaborate than I'd realized during my hurried exploration. The walls were covered with artwork, childlike drawings and paintings that Eleanor had clearly made over the years. There were shelves full of books, puzzles, and what looked like craft supplies. It wasn't just a room where someone was hidden away. It was a home, and in the hospital bed at the center of it all was Eleanor. She was smaller than I'd expected, probably only about 5 feet tall, with grey hair like Margaret's but cut short in a simple bob. Her face had the same bone structure as my wife's, but there was something different about her expression, an openness, an innocence that reminded me of the children Margaret taught at school. Eleanor clutched a worn stuffed rabbit to her chest and stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. "Hello, Eleanor," I said softly. "I'm Robert. I'm very pleased to meet you." She didn't respond, just continued to stare at me, like I might suddenly transform into something dangerous. Margaret set the tea tray on the bedside table and sat down in the chair next to the bed. "Eleanor, remember what we talked about? Robert is my husband. He lives upstairs with me. He's been taking care of me and now he wants to help take care of you too. Is he going to make me go away?" Eleanor's voice was high and tremulous. "No," I said firmly. "I would never make you go anywhere you didn't want to go. This is your home." Eleanor looked at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. "Robert brought you the chocolate yesterday, remember? He wants to be your friend." For the next 20 minutes I sat quietly, while Margaret went through what was clearly their established evening routine. She checked Eleanor's medications, helped her sip some tea, and listened while Eleanor told her about a book she'd been reading. It was a children's book about a bunny who was afraid of the dark, and Eleanor's commentary was insightful, despite her childlike manner of speaking. "The bunny reminds me of me," Eleanor said. "Sometimes I get scared when Margaret goes upstairs and I'm all alone down here." "You're never alone for very long," Margaret said gently. "I always come back. But what if something happens to you? What if you get sick or hurt and can't come back?" I saw Margaret's face tighten with pain. This was clearly a recurring fear for Eleanor, and probably for Margaret too. What would happen to Eleanor if something happened to Margaret? "That's why Robert is here now," Margaret said. "If something ever happened to me, Robert would take care of you. You'd never be alone." Eleanor looked at me with those wide, trusting eyes. "Promise?" The word came out of my mouth before I even thought about it. "I promise." A smile spread across Eleanor's face, the first real smile I'd seen from her. "Okay then. You can come visit me again tomorrow if you want." As we walked back upstairs, I felt like my entire understanding of my marriage had shifted. For 20 years, Margaret had been living a double life, caring for a sister who needed constant attention and medical care, never once complaining or asking for help. But the question that had been nagging at me remained, What had Margaret been doing in the basement for the first 20 years of our marriage, before Eleanor came to live with us? The next day, while Margaret was at work, I went back down to that room. Eleanor seemed less frightened of me this time, though she kept her stuffed rabbit close. "Margaret says you've been living here for 20 years, I said as I sat in the chair beside her bed. 21 years in December, Eleanor said proudly. Margaret lets me mark the days on a calendar. Do you want to see? She pointed to a wall calendar covered with X's and stickers. 21 years of marking time in a basement room. Eleanor, can I ask you something? Before you came to live here, did Margaret ever come down to this room? Eleanor tilted her head, considering the question. She used to come down here when I was still living at the bad place. She would sit down here and write letters to me and look at pictures. She said it made her feel closer to me. The bad place? The hospital where I lived before. Margaret called it an institution, but I called it the bad place because the people there weren't very nice. They said I was too slow and too much trouble. My heart ached for this innocent woman who had been mistreated simply because she was different. But her words also explained the mystery of Margaret's early basement visits. She'd been creating a shrine to her sister, a place where she could feel connected to Eleanor during their long separation. Margaret saved me, Eleanor continued. When Mama and Daddy died, the people at the bad place said I had to stay there forever because I had no family. But Margaret came and told them I was her sister, and she was taking me home. That must have been scary, leaving the only place you'd known for so long. It was. But Margaret promised I'd never have to go back, and she promised I could stay hidden down here where no one would bother me or be mean to me. She fixed up this room just for me with all my favorite things. I looked around the room with new eyes. Margaret hadn't just moved Eleanor into a basement room. She'd created a sanctuary. The artwork on the walls, the carefully chosen books, the soft lighting, the comfortable bed. Every detail had been planned to make Eleanor feel safe and loved. Eleanor, are you happy here? She hugged her stuffed rabbit tighter. I'm happy because Margaret loves me and takes care of me. But sometimes I get lonely. And sometimes I wonder what it would be like to go outside and see the sun. When was the last time you were outside? The day Margaret brought me here. 21 years ago. She said it matter-of-factly, like it was perfectly normal to spend 2 decades in a basement room. That evening, I shared what Eleanor had told me with Margaret. She wants to go outside, I said gently. Margaret, she hasn't seen the sun in 21 years. Margaret's face crumpled. I know. I've thought about it so many times. But Robert, you don't understand how fragile she is. The world overwhelms her. Loud noises, too many people, unexpected changes. They send her into panic attacks that can last for hours. What if we started small? What if we just took her to our backyard? It's private, quiet. And what if someone sees her? What if a neighbor asks questions? Eleanor would be devastated if she thought people were talking about her or pitying her. I could see the conflict in Margaret's eyes. She wanted to give Eleanor more freedom, but 21 years of protecting her sister had made Margaret almost as afraid of the outside world as Eleanor was. Let me ask you something, I said. Whose idea was it for Eleanor to stay hidden? Hers or yours? Margaret was quiet for a long time. When I first brought her home, she was terrified that I would send her back to the institution. She begged me to let her stay in the basement where she'd feel safe. But over the years, I think I became afraid too. Afraid that if anyone found out about her, social services might try to take her away. Afraid that people would judge her or judge me for keeping her hidden. Margaret, Eleanor is an adult. She has the right to make her own choices about how she wants to live. But she's not like other adults, Robert. Her mind, she thinks like a child in many ways. I have to protect her. From what? From sunshine? From fresh air? From the possibility of making a friend besides you? The words came out harsher than I'd intended, and I saw Margaret flinch. But they needed to be said. You've given Eleanor a safe place to live, I continued more gently. You've given her love and care, and devoted your life to her well-being. But Margaret, you've also given her a prison. That night Margaret went down to the basement at her usual time, but she stayed much longer than normal. When she came back to bed, I could tell she'd been crying. What did you and Eleanor talk about? I asked. I asked her if she wanted to try going outside. Just to our backyard, just for a few minutes. What did she say? She said yes. She said she's been wanting to ask me for years, but she was afraid I'd be angry with her for being ungrateful. My heart broke a little more. Eleanor had been wanting freedom, but had been afraid to ask for it. And Margaret had been wanting to give her freedom, but had been afraid to offer it. Two women who loved each other, both trapped by their own fears. When? I asked. Tomorrow evening after I get home from work. She wants you to be there too. She said she trusts you now. The next evening, the three of us stood at the basement door together. Eleanor was dressed in a simple blue dress and cardigan, and she clutched her stuffed rabbit with one hand and Margaret's arm with the other. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of excitement and terror. Are you sure about this? Margaret asked her for the dozenth time. I'm sure, Eleanor said, though her voice was shaking. We walked slowly through the house, Eleanor marveling at rooms she'd only heard about from Margaret's descriptions. The kitchen, the living room, the staircase leading to the second floor. Everything was new and wonderful and slightly overwhelming. At the back door, Eleanor stopped. Through the glass, she could see our small backyard, the lawn I mowed every week, the flower beds Margaret tended, the old oak tree we'd planted when we first moved in. It's so green, Eleanor whispered, and so bright. I opened the door and warm evening air flowed into the house. Eleanor took a tentative step onto the back porch, then another. When her bare feet touched the grass for the first time in 21 years, she began to cry. It's soft, she said through her tears. I'd forgotten how soft grass feels. We stayed outside for only 10 minutes that first time. Eleanor was overwhelmed by the sensations, the feel of breeze on her skin, the sound of birds singing, the sight of clouds moving across the sky. But she was also radiant with joy. Can we do this again tomorrow? She asked as we prepared to go back inside. If you want to, Margaret said, and I could see her beginning to realize that maybe protecting Eleanor didn't have to mean hiding her away. Over the next few weeks, our evening routine changed. Instead of Margaret going down to the basement alone, the three of us would spend time together. Sometimes in Eleanor's room, sometimes in the backyard, sometimes just sitting in the kitchen while Eleanor watched Margaret cook dinner. Eleanor was like a flower that had been kept in the dark, finally getting sunlight. She began to smile more, to ask questions about the world outside, to express opinions and preferences she'd kept hidden for years, but it was during one of these evening conversations that Eleanor said something that made me realize there was still more to Margaret's story than I knew, Margaret, Eleanor said as we sat in the backyard watching the sunset. Do you ever miss the other baby? Margaret went very still. What other baby, Eleanor? The one from before. The one you used to cry about when you came to visit me at the bad place. You said the baby went to heaven. I looked at Margaret, whose face had gone completely white. What is Eleanor talking about? Margaret stood up abruptly. Eleanor, I think it's time for your medication. But Eleanor continued talking, oblivious to the tension she'd created. You used to bring pictures of the baby when you visited me. You said someday you'd have another baby, but then you never did. I always wondered why. Margaret was backing toward the house, her face a mask of pain. Eleanor, please. Not now, but I couldn't let this go. Not after everything we'd been through, all the secrets that had finally been revealed. Margaret, what baby is Eleanor talking about? Margaret stopped walking and turned to face me, tears streaming down her cheeks. We had a daughter, Robert, before we met. I had a daughter, and she died when she was 6 months old. The words hit me like a physical blow. A daughter. Margaret had had a child before we met, a child who had died, and in 40 years of marriage she had never told me. Her name was Sarah, Margaret whispered. She was born when I was 19. The father left when he found out I was pregnant. Sarah lived for 6 months, and then she stopped breathing one night. Sudden infant death syndrome, the doctors said. I stared at my wife, trying to process this revelation. Margaret, why didn't you ever tell me? Because it hurt too much. Because every time I tried to have another baby with you, I was terrified the same thing would happen, because I thought if I never talked about Sarah, maybe the pain would go away. Is that why we never had children together? Margaret nodded, sobbing now. Every time we talked about starting a family, I would panic. I would make excuses, say we should wait a little longer. I was so afraid of losing another child that I chose to have no children at all. Eleanor had been listening to this conversation with growing distress. I'm sorry, she said, her voice small. I didn't mean to make you sad. I didn't know it was a secret. Margaret knelt down beside Eleanor's chair and took her hands. It's not your fault, sweetheart. It's my fault for keeping so many secrets for so long. As we sat there in the gathering darkness, I realized that Margaret's nightly trips to the basement hadn't started as visits to Eleanor. They'd started 42 years ago as visits to the memory of her lost daughter. The basement had been her place to grieve, to remember, to hold on to the pain of losing Sarah. And when Eleanor had come to live with us, Margaret had transformed her place of grief into a place of love and protection. She'd taken the room where she'd mourned one lost family member and used it to save another. But in doing so, she'd created a new kind of prison, not just for Eleanor, but for herself. For 21 years, Margaret had been trapped in the basement just as much as Eleanor was, tethered by guilt and fear and the weight of too many secrets. That night, as we prepared for bed, I took Margaret's hands in mine. 40 years, I said. 40 years of marriage, and I'm just now learning who you really are. Are you angry with me? She asked quietly. I thought about it. The years of wondering, the nights of listening to her footsteps on the basement stairs, the secrets within secrets that had finally been revealed. Was I angry? I'm sad, I said finally. Sad that you carried all of this alone for so long. Sad that you felt you couldn't trust me with the truth. But angry? No, I'm not angry. I'm amazed by your strength, and I'm grateful that you finally let me in. What happens now? Margaret asked. I looked toward the basement, thinking about Eleanor sleeping in her room below us, thinking about the years of secrets that had finally been brought into the light. Now we figure out how to live honestly, I said, all three of us together. 3 months later, our lives had settled into a new rhythm that I never could have imagined. Eleanor had her own bedroom on the main floor now. We'd converted my old home office into a bright, cheerful space with windows that let in natural light. She still kept her basement room as a retreat when the world felt too overwhelming, but she spent most of her days upstairs with us. The transformation in Eleanor was remarkable. The frightened, childlike woman I'd first met had blossomed into someone with opinions, preferences, and a surprisingly sharp sense of humor. She'd started helping Margaret in the garden, and her excitement over watching tomatoes grow from tiny seedlings to full plants was infectious. Robert, she said one morning as we sat on the back porch drinking coffee, do you think the neighbors wonder about me? It was a question she'd been asking more often lately as her world expanded. What do you mean? I mean, I'm 43 years old, but I've never had a job or lived on my own or done any of the things adults are supposed to do. Do you think they wonder why I'm different? I considered her question carefully. Eleanor had been venturing into the front yard recently, always with Margaret or me nearby, and she'd waved shyly at Mrs. Henderson next door. I think people wonder about lots of things, but that doesn't mean they judge. And even if they do, that's their problem, not yours. Margaret used to say that if people knew about me, they'd feel sorry for me. But I don't want people to feel sorry for me. I just want them to think I'm normal. Eleanor, what's normal? I'm 62 years old, and I just learned that my wife had a daughter before we met and has been caring for her sister in secret for 20 years. None of us are normal. She laughed at that. Eleanor had a wonderful laugh, bright and uninhibited. When you put it that way, our family is pretty strange. Our family. She'd started calling us that a few weeks ago, and it never failed to warm my heart. Margaret had been seeing a counselor to help her process years of carrying secrets alone. Dr. Patricia Stevens came to the house twice a week, and sometimes she met with all three of us together to help us navigate our new family dynamic. Caregiver fatigue, Dr. Stevens had called it during one of our sessions. Margaret, you've been in crisis mode for over 20 years. It's going to take time to learn how to live without that constant state of vigilance. It was true. Margaret had trouble sleeping some nights, unable to break the habit of listening for Eleanor's bell, or worrying that something terrible would happen if she wasn't constantly watching over her sister. But gradually she was learning to trust that Eleanor was safe, that I was there to help, that she didn't have to carry the entire burden alone anymore. One evening in late summer, Eleanor made an announcement that surprised us both. I want to get a job, she said over dinner. Margaret nearly choked on her soup. A job? Not a big job, Eleanor clarified quickly, but something. Mrs. Henderson told me that the library needs volunteers to help with their children's reading program. She said I'd be good at it because I'm patient and I like kids. Margaret's first instinct was clearly to say no. I could see the panic in her eyes. the immediate need to protect Eleanor from potential disappointment or rejection. But she caught herself and took a deep breath. "That sounds wonderful," she said finally. "Do you want me to call and ask about it?" Eleanor beamed. "Yes, please, but I want to go to the interview by myself. Well, not by myself. With Robert." I was touched that Eleanor wanted me to accompany her, but I was also nervous. What if the librarians didn't understand Eleanor's limitations? What if they were unkind? What if this venture into the wider world ended in heartbreak? But Dr. Stevens had been working with us on the difference between protecting someone and controlling them. And I knew that Eleanor had the right to try, even if she might fail. The interview was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Eleanor spent days preparing, practicing how to shake hands and introduce herself, rehearsing answers to questions Margaret helped her anticipate. "What if they ask why I've never had a job before?" Eleanor worried. "Tell them the truth," I said. "You were caring for your family, and now you're ready to try something new." It wasn't entirely a lie. Eleanor had been dealing with her own health issues and limitations. She was ready for something new. On the day of the interview, Eleanor wore her best dress, a soft yellow one that Margaret had bought her for special occasions, and carried a small purse that contained her social security card and a letter from Dr. Stevens, explaining her situation in general terms. The head librarian, Mrs. Janet Powell, was a kind woman in her 50s who immediately put Eleanor at ease. She asked simple questions about why Eleanor wanted to volunteer and what she hoped to gain from the experience. "I love children," Eleanor said earnestly, "and I love books. My sister Margaret is a teacher, and she taught me that reading opens up whole new worlds for kids." Mrs. Powell smiled. "That's exactly the kind of enthusiasm we're looking for. Would you like to see where our children's programs take place?" Eleanor's eyes lit up as Mrs. Powell showed us the children's section of the library, with its colorful carpets and low shelves filled with picture books. She explained that volunteers would help during story time, assist children with selecting books, and sometimes help with simple crafts. "It sounds perfect," Eleanor said, and I could hear the genuine excitement in her voice. "We'd like to start you with one afternoon a week," Mrs. Powell said. "See how it goes, and if you enjoy it, we can expand from there." As we walked home from the library, Eleanor was practically glowing. "I got a job, Robert. I actually got a job." "You did indeed. So I'm proud of you. Do you think Margaret will be proud too?" "I think Margaret will be thrilled," and she was. When we told her about Eleanor's success, Margaret cried happy tears. "My little sister, contributing to the community," she said, hugging Eleanor tight. "Mom and Dad would be so proud." Eleanor's first day at the library was the following week. I drove her there and planned to pick her up afterward, but when I arrived, I found Eleanor in the children's section surrounded by a group of kindergartners, reading them a story about a brave little mouse. Her voice was clear and confident as she gave each character a different accent, and the children were captivated. One little boy with dark hair reminded me of how I imagined Michael might have looked at that age. Michael, the son Margaret and I never had, because she was too afraid of losing another child. After the children left with their parents, Mrs. Powell approached me. "Your sister-in-law is a natural," she said. "The children absolutely adore her. She has a gift, a gift." Eleanor, who had spent 43 years believing she was a burden, had a gift. That night, Eleanor chatted excitedly about her day over dinner. She told us about each child she'd met, about the books they'd chosen, about the little girl who'd asked if Eleanor would be there next week. "I told her yes," Eleanor said. "I'll be there every Tuesday from now on." It was a promise that Eleanor kept for the next 2 years. During that time, our family continued to evolve. Eleanor became a beloved fixture at the library, known for her patience with difficult children and her creative approach to storytelling. She made friends among the other volunteers and even started attending the library's monthly book club for adults. Margaret gradually reduced her teaching hours, preparing for retirement. But instead of spending her free time worrying about Eleanor, she began pursuing hobbies she'd neglected for decades. She joined a gardening club, started taking pottery classes, and even convinced Eleanor to try painting. As for me, I found myself marveling daily at the richness that had been added to our lives. Eleanor brought a perspective I'd never experienced, a wonder at simple things, an ability to find joy in moments that others might overlook. She taught me to notice the way morning light fell across the kitchen table, to appreciate the sound of rain on the roof, to find humor in everyday mishaps. But perhaps most importantly, Eleanor's presence in our lives had forced Margaret and me to finally be completely honest with each other. We'd started talking about things we'd never discussed before. Margaret's grief over losing Sarah, my own feelings about never becoming a father, the ways we'd both built walls around painful subjects. One evening, as we sat in the backyard watching Eleanor tend to her flower garden, Margaret took my hand. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Learning about Eleanor, about all my secrets?" "Sometimes I think your life was simpler before you knew." I considered her question. My life had certainly been simpler when I didn't know about Eleanor's existence, when I assumed Margaret's basement visits were just quirky habits, when I believed my wife's only secrets were minor. Ones like surprise birthday gifts or plans for redecorating the living room. But simpler wasn't necessarily better. "I regret that you felt you had to carry all of this alone for so long," I said. "I regret that Eleanor spent 21 years hidden away when she could have been part of our family from the beginning. But do I regret knowing the truth? Never. Even though it changed everything? It changed everything for the better, Margaret. Look at her." I nodded toward Eleanor, who was explaining to a butterfly why it should pollinate her zinnias. "Look at how much joy she's brought into our lives. Look at how much you've been able to relax and enjoy life now that you're not keeping so many secrets." Margaret was quiet for a moment, watching her sister with a soft smile. "I used to think that protecting someone meant hiding them away from anything that might hurt them. But I was wrong, wasn't I?" "You weren't wrong to want to protect Eleanor. You were wrong to think that you had to do it alone." That night, for the first time in 42 years, Margaret didn't go to the basement. There was no longer any need. Eleanor was upstairs in her own room, safe and happy and free to live her life openly. As we lay in bed, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this point. A marriage built on love but shadowed by secrets. A woman who had sacrificed her own happiness to care for others. A sister who had lived hidden away from the world but had somehow managed to maintain her capacity for joy and wonder. None of it had been what I'd expected when I'd married Margaret 42 years ago. But life rarely unfolds the way we expect it to. "Robert?" Margaret's voice was soft in the darkness. "Thank you. For what?" "For not giving up on us. For caring enough to follow me down those basement stairs. For loving Eleanor like she's your own sister." I pulled Margaret closer, feeling grateful for the strange and wonderful family we'd become. "Thank you for finally trusting me with the truth. All of it." Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, the sound soft and soothing against our windows. Somewhere in the house, Eleanor was probably lying awake listening to it too, maybe thinking about the children she'd read to that afternoon, or planning what story she'd share with them next week. For 40 years, I'd fallen asleep to the sound of Margaret's footsteps on the basement stairs, wondering what secrets she was keeping in the darkness below. Now I fell asleep to the sound of rain, and the knowledge that there were no more secrets between us, no more walls, no more hidden rooms in our marriage or our hearts. The basement door stood open now, no longer locked, no longer hiding anything. Eleanor still used the room sometimes when she wanted quiet time or when the upstairs world felt too overwhelming. But it was no longer a prison for anyone. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if I'd never followed Margaret down those stairs, if I'd continued to accept her late-night absences without question. Eleanor might have lived out her entire life in that basement room, hidden from the world, known only to Margaret. Margaret might have continued carrying her burden of secrets until it crushed her, and I might have spent the rest of my life married to a woman I never really knew. But that's not what happened. Sometimes curiosity leads to heartbreak, but sometimes it leads to understanding. Sometimes the truth hurts, but sometimes it sets everyone free. Our family isn't conventional. Eleanor will always need more care and support than most adults her age. Margaret will always be protective of her sister, and I will always be learning how to balance respect for Eleanor's independence with awareness of her limitations. But we're honest with each other now. We're open about our fears, our hopes, our mistakes, our joys. We've learned that love isn't about protecting people from every possible hurt. It's about being there for them when hurt comes, and celebrating with them when joy arrives. And joy does arrive. Every Tuesday when Eleanor comes home from the library, bubbling with stories about the children she's met. Every morning when she discovers a new flower blooming in her garden. Every evening when the three of us sit on the back porch and Eleanor asks questions about the world that make us see it through fresh eyes. 40 years of marriage taught me that I knew my wife. 3 years of living honestly taught me that knowing someone is an ongoing process, not a destination. People have depths you never suspect, strengths you never imagined, capacity for love that can surprise you even after decades together. Margaret kept secrets for 40 years, but in the end, her secrets weren't shameful things to be hidden away. They were evidence of her enormous capacity for love, sacrifice, and devotion. She wasn't protecting Eleanor from the world. She was protecting the world from losing Eleanor's unique light. Now that light shines freely, brightening not just our home, but our entire community. The children at the library call Eleanor Miss Ellie and run to hug her when she arrives each Tuesday. The neighbors have come to know her as the gentlewoman who always has a kind word and a smile. The grocery store clerks recognize her and ask about her flowers. Eleanor has become part of the world in a way that Margaret never thought possible, and the world is better for having her in it. Sometimes the most beautiful things in life are hidden in the most unexpected places. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as burdens. And sometimes the people we think we're protecting are actually the ones protecting us. From cynicism, from taking simple joys for granted, from forgetting what unconditional love really means. If you're keeping secrets to protect someone you love, ask yourself, who are you really protecting? And what might be possible if you trusted that love is strong enough to survive in the light? The basement stairs don't creak anymore. I fixed them last month. But I still hear Margaret's footsteps every night as she checks on Eleanor before coming to bed. The difference is, now I know exactly where she's going and why. There are no more mysteries in our house, no more locked doors, no more hidden rooms, and our marriage has never been stronger.